There we go. There's a reason I always do this with two phones. Let's try that again. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our National TPP call. Tonight we're going to be talking about time for justice, time for system change. Our guest speakers tonight are Paul Quintos from Ibon Int'l, our old friend Celeste Drake from the AFL-CIO. We're going to be joined a little bit later by Mackenzie McDonald-Wilson of Popular Resistance, Harriet Haywood of MoveOn.org, and Adam Wiseman. As I said before, I'm Andrea Miller. I'm going to go over briefly some technical stuff. And the technical stuff is that if you are in this room, in order to hear the audio, you are going to need to dial in. We don't use the audio from the meeting room. We actually use the audio on the telephone so that we have much better quality. The meeting room that we are using has a chat box, which I see people availing themselves of over on the left-hand side of the screen. At the bottom right of your screen, and I mean literally all the way down at the bottom right corner, there is a share button. If you would like to have a copy of this PowerPoint, you can at any time click on the share button and then download the National TPP September 20th PowerPoint. And then you will have it for your very own. It takes a lot of people to organize a call like this. Tom Hotking is our technical advisor. He's a member of the call planning team. He himself is an organizer. He's with MoveOn.org, and he's a regional organizer in Pennsylvania. And Tom can handle any pre- or post-call technical questions. Tom also manages our global TPP team Facebook page. Liz Amston is one of the people that is our note taker. She is on the call planning team. She does call reports, notes, and resource vetting. She's a MoveOn regional organizer in California. We also have Jan Schwartzendruber. Jan is a MoveOn regional organizer from Kansas, and she also works with our notes. In the chat room, Mark Cohen is not with us this week. She is part of PD Action's mass criminalization team. She's one of our leaders, and she's also part of the Global Climate Convergence in Illinois. We also have Lisa Oldendorf with us tonight. She will also be working in the chat room, and she's a regional organizer from MoveOn New York. Also with us tonight is Linda Brewster. Linda's also part of our call planning team, and she's a MoveOn regional organizer in Washington State. And our very first report is going to come from Celeste Drake, and there was some noise on Celeste's line. So Celeste, let me find you. There you are. And I've got your line open. So Celeste is on our call planning team. She's the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist from the AFL-CIO. She's going to give us some updates on legislative action and the TPP negotiating update. So, Celeste, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll try and get through this pretty quick. So, as folks know, the U.S. government and others are a bit desperate to finish the TPP so that they don't have to take a break while the U.S. is in presidential election mode and push it back to lame duck. So they're doing everything that they can to finish it as quickly as possible. And in light of that, the auto negotiators who kind of broke up the Hawaii round will be meeting in San Francisco tomorrow and Tuesday to try and see if Canada and Mexico, which have been holding out for a higher rule of origin for cars and car parts, meaning more of it would have to come from the 12 TPP countries to qualify for the tariff benefits of the TPP. That we'll see if they can agree with the U.S. and the Japanese, which want preferential tariff rates to apply to cars and car parts with very low origin from the TPP countries. If they reach an agreement, then they will go to the next step of trying to have a final negotiating round, which is likely to be in Atlanta, although it's not confirmed. We've been hearing possibly New York, so folks should be sort of on alert or standby that this, actions might be necessary in New York. And as you can see on the slide, the chief negotiators would meet tentatively September 26th through 30th in Atlanta or New York. And if they get their work done, then the trade ministers would come in following and try to finalize the deal from the 30th to the 4th. Now, they have said repeatedly they don't want to get the ministers together again unless they know absolutely that it's a done deal. So, this may or may not happen. What the AFL-CIO is doing in Atlanta is we are going to have a resolution against the TPP introduced tomorrow in the Atlanta City Council. And if there is anybody that's in Atlanta and can get down to the City Council meeting tomorrow and sign up to be a speaker, you can say, what a great resolution it is and what the dangers of the TPP are. If it looks like they've got kind of a majority for the resolution, the backers may try to have it voted up and approved all in one day, so introduced, approved all in the same day. If they're not so sure, they'll table it and see if they can do more later. But the idea is that when these folks get to town, this is already a controversial thing in Atlanta, and Atlanta is saying, you don't do this here. We don't want to be named as the city where the TPP was completed and have that, tarnish our future. Now, given the possibility that it's in New York, we're going to try and see if we can orchestrate in a similarly quick manner an anti-TPP resolution being introduced in the New York City Council. And if folks remember, de Blasio, the administration was leaning hard on de Blasio during the fast-track fight, trying to get him to come out with other mayors who had joined Mayors for Fast Track. So we think we have an ally there, and we think this is something that's potentially doable in New York as well. In terms of mass turnout events and other places that people can go or things that people can do in each of these three cities, this is all going very quickly. So I would say watch your emails, go to the websites, go to the Global TPP Team group, the TPP, TTIP, and Globalization Watch group on Facebook. Go to Flush the TPP and look for information because this is all sort of being planned on the fly. I know that Friends of the Earth is active, Citizens Trade Campaign is active. Lots of folks are planning, but I haven't heard a lot of concrete details. So we're moving as we can on this, and that's what's really critical. And then just to give an update on the UN Human Rights Report, it's interesting. The UN is doing us a lot more favors recently on trade. They have, the rapporteurs there have knocked the secrecy of trade negotiations, both for the TPP and the TTIP. And they also have now talked about the dangers of ISDS and how it really is not pro-human rights and pro-development. And that happened in the same week that the Europeans introduced a quote-unquote ISDS alternative that they want to propose in the TTIP, which is the agreement between the U.S. and Europe. It's called like the International Court of Settlement. It would be an international investment court. And though people are still studying it, yes, there are definite things that are improved over ISDS, but it's got so many of the same problems that I don't think any critics of ISDS are going to be turning around and cheering. And it's just something to keep an eye on, because you'll be hearing more and more about that in the future. And just know that it doesn't fix the problem. Things that are a danger of ISDS remain a danger in the new European proposal. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Celeste. That was an encouraging report that there are, again, more negotiations and still more possibilities for things to go wrong and the negotiators to not agree.
Absolutely.
Not good for them, but great for us. So we're going to keep up the fight. Thank you. I don't believe Mackenzie is going to be with us tonight, but I did see Dr. Margaret Flowers from Popular Resistance. So, Margaret, are you going to be Mackenzie tonight?
I don't think I could ever live up to being Mackenzie, but I'll do my best, yeah. Can you hear me?
For joining.
Sure, Mackenzie. Great, yeah. Mackenzie, as you know, is fasting for 18 days, water only, and so we're trying to give him a little bit of a break right now while he tries to complete this fast. So just to follow up on what Celeste said, this is absolutely a critical time. Things are somewhat fragile and they're really on the go. Wanted to give you kind of two pieces of news from Canada and from Japan. The Prime Minister Harper actually let it slip that the Canadian unions would not be very happy with what he's negotiating in the TPP around automobiles. And so that has started to enrage some of the unions, and they're getting a little bit more activated in making the TPP a big part of their campaign. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming days if there really is some good pushback in Canada around that. Their elections are October 19th, so Canada really wants to get this done while Harper is still in power. The polls right now are kind of all over the place up there. For a while, the very left party, the NDP, was winning, but now that's not so clear anymore. In Japan, it's really interesting. Prime Minister Abe, who's also up for re-election, is very unpopular right now. He's been trying to change the constitution so that Japan can change their military from a defensive to an offensive force. The United States is pushing Prime Minister Abe to do this. And the Diet, which is their equivalent of Congress, actually the majority party there took over the process when they were having a vote on this bill of whether to allow the military to be an offensive force, and subverted the whole process through actually physically taking over the chairman's table, taking away the microphone, preventing there from being a recorded vote. And so that was the first time ever in Japanese history that something like that has happened. So really interesting kind of what's going on in these two countries right now. So in addition to being vigilant about what's happening this month in terms of the negotiations, I do want to remind people that if the TPP is signed, it will be then going to Congress, and we do have some things coming up in the fall. So the October 10th to 17th is the solidarity actions with our transatlantic partners. Congress members will be in district at that time, so we're encouraging people to do things locally. You can do any kind of action that you think is appropriate. It could be doing a visibility action where you're out in a public place with signs and things, handing out flyers. It could be setting up an educational event in your community. It could be visiting your member of Congress or holding a rally at their office or doing some sort of creative action there to remind them that we don't want them to pass the TPP. You could organize a TPP-free zone, some sort of a resolution like they're starting to do going to do in Atlanta. We can help with that. So lots of different things that people can do. If you organize an action, let us know at Flush the TPP, and we'll put it on the action calendar. And then we are building towards a DC action November 14th to 18th. We'll have 2 days of training and 3 days of creative direct action. We're happy to report that Bill Moyer from the Backbone campaign is going to join us as one of the trainers and strategists for those days of action. And if you've never worked with Bill, he's an amazing creative activist. We've done a number of past actions with him. Check out backbonecampaign.org to see what they do. I guarantee that it will be very fun, very informative, and creative and powerful. And there are things that all people can do. So no matter what your skills or your level of risk-taking, there will be something for everyone. So let us know if you're interested in joining us for those actions. We do have training space, accommodation, and we'll be providing food. So if you can get to D.C., then please join us. And I think that's everything. Thank you, Andrea.
Margaret, are you having a call on Wednesday?
Oh, thank you. Slight detail. We are still doing the calls right now every other Wednesday. So we just had one on the 16th, and the next one then would be on the 30th, I guess. Look at the calendar.
Okay, great. And what I'd like to do, Margaret, is I would like to put your call up on our event page along with ours so that people know that, you're having a call, we're having a call, and then it's just out there. People are not, darn, I forgot.
That would be great. And we did have a glitch with the Maestro system that lost some of the registration, so we have a new link for registration. It is up on the page on Flush the TPP under the news section at the top, the post that is for the TPP resistance call. So use the link on that to register. Thanks.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Margaret. And as Margaret said, it really, really is important that you do something wherever your comfort zone lies, because even though we are very active on the TPP, there are still so many of our friends and neighbors who really know nothing about this and have no idea how serious this is, and basically that this changes America as we know it. I want to bring up Susie Chestnut. Susie, your line should be open. Susie,
I'm here. Hi, Andrea. Hello.
Yeah,
do you hear me?
Great. We hear you fine.
Great. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody who participated in our Twitter storm last week. We're using the hashtag, among others, of Stop TPP. And last week, the March Against Monsanto's Stop TPP aggregator picked up most of our tweets, had them up there for hours. It looked really good, and it was really nice to get all that exposure. I think they have, I don't know where I got this information, but I think they have approximately 23,000 people who come to their site. And the tweets this week will be on the same theme of time for justice, time for system change. The actions that everyone's been speaking about in tonight's call will be part of the tweets. The tweets will primarily focus on climate justice, because the Pope will be in town in New York, and he'll be in D.C. September 24th and in New York September 25th. He's been very outspoken about human rights and the dangers of corporatism and free trade, and he did part of the encyclical was about the environment. So we're coupling all of that together with our calls to action, and that will pretty much be the Twitter storm for this week. So hope to see everybody out in Twitter sphere.
All righty, and the tweets are going to be available when, Susie?
They're usually available sometime Tuesday at the latest, I would think 3 o'clock Eastern time, and they're on the TPP Media March Facebook page, I think, or website. I have the link here. It's the word tiny.cc/TPP Media March. So that's tiny.cc/TPP Media March. You can pick them up there.
All right, and for people who may have previously done the Twitter storms before July, it's the same page that you always visit. We just have a new short link for it. All right, I want to bring up Harriet. Harriet's part of our call planning team. She's a call organizer. She's a Move On regional organizer in the state of Florida. And Harriet's going to give us an update on what's going on in Miami with the TPP campaign. Harriet, floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to go as fast as I can on this. First, I wanted to say I attended the planning meeting in Miami with Citizens Trade, Deborah Deanne, Fred Frost, and about 10 other people leading the Miami organizing for the TTIP ministerial coming up. And this is kind of a tentative plan right now. First off, on October 19th, they're planning a morning press conference with members of Congress. They've already confirmed Representative Alcee Hastings, and they're working on getting others that are especially, that have indicated that they are against TPP, like Alan Grayson, Chris Murphy, Frederica Wilson, and other congressional leaders. Then on the 20th, they're going to be holding a town hall meeting or a community forum at a local church. And then on October 21st, there will be a press conference with national leaders and speakers. According to Citizens Trade, are going to be our own Celeste Drake, Mike Dolan with the Teamsters, Solomon, Sierra Club Trade Policy, Peter Maybardik, he is with Public Citizens Access to Medicines, and Sharon Treat for the Center for International Environmental Law. So, and they are still expanding on getting those great nationally known speakers. October 21st, they will be holding a stakeholder meeting, which is really important, especially for Miami. They're lining up local speakers on different issues. They're going to be lining up speakers on labor, food and water. They have professors they're lining up, clergy, local elected officials, and others. And what they want to do on that day is really pack the room with labor and activists. So that is going to be a really good day for all you Florida people to show up there. The rest of the week, they're going to be establishing a press war room at the host hotel. We don't really know exactly which hotel this is going to be, but they will be doing rapid response briefings on various topics like Malaysia's upgrade on human trafficking, also fracking, which is a huge issue in Florida, and also climate change, especially down in Miami. That's a really big issue down there. So then there are other mobilizations ahead of the week of action, and they're working on getting the AFL-CIO to pass a resolution at their Orlando convention. That's going to be September 26th and 27th. October 8th, this is really neat. The City of Miami Commissioner and Chair Willie Gort, they're going to be working on passing a resolution against TPP at the City of Miami. So they're going to really want to pack the room for that also. And then October 14th, you probably all realize that that's the People's Climate March. And they're going to have a march in Miami, so they're going to really get out and support the march and pass out leaflets on that day with the coalition partners. And some of those coalition partners were actually at the meeting the other day in Miami, so that was really, really great. And, I just wanted to say, we can win this fight, but we can't do it from our desks and our phones. I know we can't all get out, but, we can get people out. If we can't make it ourselves, we've got to mobilize in the streets on these actions. And also, I did also want to say that CTC Miami thinks it's also a great idea if other groups have other plans for Miami as well. So I just wanted to make sure everybody come to Miami, come to Atlanta, and, let's let these officials know that it's not okay to, to pass the TPP. Thank you. And TTIP. Thanks.
Thank you, Harriet. The last member of our call planning team that I'm going to bring up is Adam Weitzman. Adam is with Trade Justice, Global Justice for Animals and the Environment. Adam is going to walk us through some additional upcoming events as well as some news information and news articles that we're going to want to know about. So, Adam, go ahead, please. Adam, I saw you.
Hi, I was just unmuting.
There you are. Okay,
yep.
Great.
Can you hear me? Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. So what I'm going to be announcing leads right into our featured speaker. I'm going to be talking first about the days of action coming up in New York City surrounding the UN Sustainable Development Summit. But before I do that, I want to first talk about make sure that people have the webinar link. A lot of the announcements that went out did not have the link. So I made a short link to make it easier for people to go there. You're definitely going to want to have this webinar link before the featured presentation because there are a lot of slides tonight. So if you're not already in the online meeting room, if you go to tradejustice.net/920, that will take you to the online meeting room, and definitely go in there now because you don't want to miss these very informative slides in the next presentation. They're packed with information that will be beyond just what you can get by listening. Again, that's tradejustice.net/920. Okay, so moving ahead into the events coming up, as I said, there will be a week. There are days of action surrounding the UN Sustainable Development Summit, as we'll be hearing from our featured speaker tonight. That summit is not all it's cracked up to be. Rather than promoting a genuine agenda of sustainable development, many people feel that in fact it is providing cover for the expansion of the neoliberal agenda and is in fact a Trojan horse for rotten trade deals like TPP. So from the 24th through the 28th, there are going to be a series of actions. And of course, as we heard about from Celeste, we may also be receiving an unwelcome visitor in New York City during that time if there are TPP meetings. So you can be sure that our event schedule will be adapted if we receive that news of that unwelcome visitor. But these events are the events to plug into to find that out. But also, we will be sending updates if we do find out more. If you cannot make it to New York for these events, we will be making an effort to live stream them. So if you click on the links for the individual events, you can get the details on the events. All these events can be found at tradejustice.net/events, all lowercase. So just to run through them quickly. On Thursday, September 24th, there's going to be a Speak Out for Climate Justice. Friday, September 25th, the Park Slope Food Co-op, the largest food co-op in the nation, is holding a forum on U.S. trade policy hosted by their International Trade Education Squad, looking at issues like country of origin labeling, looking at issues like how agreements like TPP and TTIP could threaten our right to label genetically modified foods, looking at the detrimental impact of investor-state dispute settlement on consumer rights policies. Starting that same night and running into the next day, there will be an international tribunal of conscience on human rights, immigrant justice, and the impact of U.S. policy in Mexico and Central America. The devastating impacts of NAFTA and CAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA-DR, will be a major theme of this conference, and that will lead directly into a march against forced migration and displacement, where we will have the opportunity to talk about how free trade agreements tear apart communities and force people to migrate for economic survival and, in fact, for physical survival, as free trade agreements destabilize nations and promote violence. Then on Sunday, September 27th, there will be a People's General Assembly. In lieu of our weekly call that night, we're encouraging people to watch that event by live stream. As of yet, the live stream links are not up on these events, but by later in the week, if you click the events, you'll find information on how you can watch these events at live stream. That event is earlier than the call, but it runs into the normal call time. Finally, on Monday, September 28th, there will be an event called Dialogues for Justice and the Common Good, From the Margins to the Front Lines. And this is a day-long conference that will cover topics including U.S. trade policy with a breakout on that topic, but also looking at other interconnected issues, including militarization, austerity and privatization, wage depression and job insecurity, land, water, and resource grabbing, environmental degradation and climate change, human trafficking, the global financial system, state repression, and much more. So this is a great opportunity to plug in with activists really from around the world coming together for this mobilization. And to get an early taste of what's going to be happening for the week and finding out more details, to kick things off this Thursday, September 24th, Event Horizons Radio, which does a weekly feature about trade policy that I'm a guest on Thursdays at 10 a.m., will be doing a special focused program on this mobilization and on the critique of the UN Sustainable Development Summit. If people want to read more of the critique of this summit, you can go to tradejustice.net, and right under our big graphic, there's a plus, and right under there's a headline that says "Statement: Reclaim Our Future, Oppose the Corporate Development Agenda," and then there's some small text and it says "Read the Statement," and you can read an internationally endorsed statement endorsed by many NGOs and grassroots groups condemning this hypocritical push for neoliberalism under the false guise of sustainable development. Now on to some of the upcoming news. There is so much news this week that we couldn't possibly, in the time allotted, fit in all of the stories for this week. So I made a link that you can find out stories that you won't hear on the call, and that is tradejustice.net/920news. That's all lowercase. It's tradejustice.net/920news, but just 5 quick stories that we should know about. Obama is now putting out that he is confident that the TPP deal can be completed in 2015, not saying there will be a vote in 2015, but he believes the negotiations can be completed this year. The U.S. rice industry is now opposing an emerging TPP deal with a deal between the U.S. and Japan that is not in the interest of U.S. rice and could potentially lead to the U.S. rice industry opposing TPP altogether. There's an increased push from senators, both Republican and Democrat, including some people we do not normally consider friends of the global justice and fair trade movement, like Senator Rob Portman and his Ohio colleague Sherrod Brown, demanding that Chinese currency manipulation be addressed in the context of TPP. We already heard about the new alternative proposal to ISDS, which may not be such a great step forward. And finally, the Fair Trade Foundation in the UK is saying that trade policies like TTIP are undermining efforts towards global development, and particularly in light of this Sustainable Development Summit, that the goal of sustainable development is being directly undermined by these trade agreements, which are pushing poverty, not fair trade, and not development. So again, tradejustice.net/920news for many more news stories we did not have a chance to discuss today. Tradejustice.net/events. for the more information about these events. And again, if you're not yet on the webinar, definitely go there by clicking tradejustice.net/920. All those links are all lowercase. Thanks, everyone. Let's have a great week of action and many great weeks ahead.
Thank you very, very much, Adam. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, I want to introduce our very special guest tonight, Mr. Paul L. Quintos. He is the program manager at Ibon International, which is an international non-governmental organization that promotes new development thinking for economic and social justice through capacity development using people's movements around the world. Before joining Ibon, Mr. Quintos was an organizer and educator in the progressive labor movement in Philippines for more than a decade. And I know you're looking at photographs and you're going, he looks just so incredibly young. That's the first thing I thought when I saw this picture. He attained his master's degree in development studies from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and it held various positions in academia, in government, and in various NGOs. So we want to welcome him. Paul, I am hoping that your microphone is open. It looks like it is. So go ahead, and I will move to your very first slide.
Hi, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I hope. Okay, great. First of all, thank you to everyone for inviting me and for this opportunity to share our work and basically our critique of this so-called this so-called 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which, as Adam already mentioned, will be unveiled at the end of this week in New York. So and we've been tracking this process since it started about 2 years ago. So just to get ahead, if you look at how this new agenda is being hyped up, if you listen to governments, if you listen to UN officials, of course they do not fall short of hype and hyperbole in describing this agenda. So you have Secretary General Ban Ki-moon describing it as a historic turning point for our world. It's a plan of action for ending poverty in all its dimensions, irreversibly, everywhere, and leaving no one behind. And it seeks to ensure peace and prosperity and forge partnerships with people and planet at the core. And that term partnerships is a keyword. It's a buzzword, which I will try to unpack and explain later. But basically, this agenda is, of course, supposed to replace or, well, in a sense, continue the so-called unfinished agenda of the Millennium Development Goals. And if you recall, the Millennium Development Goals were unveiled 15 years ago with, of course, equally grand and noble aspirations and promises of reducing extreme poverty, of ensuring peace and prosperity, and protecting the planet. Not exactly in those words, but in those in equally very optimistic and hopeful terms. But what we have now, 15 years after this Millennium Development Goals were unveiled and this Millennium Declaration, as you all know, we're in the midst of a multiple crisis of the global capitalist system. And just, in terms of the headlines, it's not the GDP so much. It's not the conditions of the stock market as we know. It's really, if you look at the economy, it's the state of the unemployment problem remains extremely problematic. The ILO, International Labor Organization, estimates more than 200 million still unemployed, officially unemployed, and globally. And if from those who are employed, almost half of them are in so-called vulnerable forms of employment or precarious forms of employment, without contracts or only temporary contracts, and essentially deprived or denied their basic rights, labor standards, decent work. So, and that's a growing proportion of the global the labor force, no, the global employment employed population. And of course, in the social dimension, obviously can you move the slide, please, Andrea? Yeah, next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, next. Next. And of course, it's not just on the economic side, no? As we all know, the ecological crisis is worsening, and it's not just the climate crisis. Of course, the climate crisis is, I guess, the most dramatic expression of this crisis. But if you look at the slide in front of you, according to scientists, basically 3 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. The climate crisis is the most dramatic, but the second bar there shows the alarming levels of biodiversity loss, which scientists are comparing, or actually are describing as a 6th mass extinction in geological terms, no, comparable to the age when the dinosaurs were wiped out. And of course, that's because of loss of forests, of industrial overfishing, of land use conversion of natural habitats, and so on, that are destroying the ecological system and the basis for life of other species, of course, including people. And then, of course, the second to the last bar there, you see the nitrogen cycle, also in far beyond tipping points, and that directly relates to the kind of agriculture that we have today, which is chemical-intensive industrial farming, which is poisoning the land and the water systems with nitrogen-based fertilizers, artificial chemical fertilizers. And of course, so that's the extent of the ecological crisis, not just the climate crisis that we're confronting. Next slide, please. Of course, as we all know, not everyone is unhappy about this state of affairs. You have the top 1% of the global population controlling over 40%, and by the trends, they will soon control half of global wealth. That means half of all land, of all capital, of all of credit, of all savings, of all equipment, of all technology in the world. That's controlled by the top 1%, and the bottom 50%, that's us, are forced to share or survive on sharing the 1% of global wealth. So, and that extent of inequality is only deepening. And in fact, even in terms of, since the global financial crisis, which you would have expected that would have affected the elites, the financial oligarchs, well, in fact, since the crisis, the so-called recovery, most of it the gains from that recovery has mostly gone to the same people that caused the crisis, the financial oligarchs. Next slide, please. And of course, in a situation where most people, and this has been true since neoliberalism has gone on a rampage, no? In a situation where most people are exploited and underpaid and unemployed, and of course the production keeps growing, production keeps improving in terms of the technological capacity, then even capitalist bosses have a problem of where to sell and how to sell their overproduced goods, and so that's why there is growing the financial industry has been playing a growing role in terms of providing credit to the mass population. In other words, making sure that underpaid, exploited workers and people have at least some purchasing power, which is basically based on credit. So if you look at the trends, this is the chart in front of you shows the increasing indebtedness in the U.S. Economy. Households, that's the red graph, are increasingly indebted by that extent. Other financial institutions, they're of course lending one another credit. Non-financial institutions as well, and even the government, of course, is increasingly indebted. And in fact, this is true not just for the U.S. economy, but especially for the other industrialist countries. And in the case of third world countries like the Philippines, that situation has been true for over 4 decades or even before. No, that's why you had the That's why you had the financial, the debt crisis of the 80s and so on. Can you still hear me? Because
yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yeah, because I lost the PowerPoint slides in my laptop. Is it still being shown?
PowerPoint's still running.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, increasing indebtedness, and can you move the slide, please? And of course, part of that increasing financialization is not just that they're relying more on credit, on credit-driven growth or credit-driven consumption. Increasingly, they're also relying more on financial speculation. That is to say, making money from money, making money out of money, not from production, not from actual trade of actual goods and services, but in trading financial assets. And in the slide in front of you, it shows the blue graphs show the growth in the trading in financial derivatives. And of course, that really picked up since the 90s because of the deregulation of the financial industry. And that has grown far beyond the line graph in this same chart in front of you, which shows the world economic output. That is to say, the aggregate value of trade in actual goods and services. So the trading in financial paper assets has grown far beyond the extent of the real goods and services that are supposed to be underneath that, right? Because financial assets, in theory, represent future incomes from actual assets, from real assets in the real economy. And that has become, in other words, the financial sphere has become bloated far beyond the real conditions in the real economy. In short, that's the financial bubbles that are being created. And this is based on speculation, speculative activity. Some call it a casino economy. Next slide, please. And of course, we've seen the devastating consequences of that. The 2008 global financial crisis, Lehman collapse, and all the big banks, sparked by the subprime mortgage crisis, is a perfect illustration of this dynamic. Ordinary households being led to get loans. Use those loans for their consumption, for their needs, their houses, and so on. Obviously, they can't pay. Many of them can't pay because they're underpaid or unemployed and so on, underemployed. They can't pay. The banks that loan them start failing to collect money. The banks close, and then the banks that lend to those banks close, and so on. So that you had the financial crisis of 2008. Affecting not just the U.S. economy, but as far as Iceland, as South Korea, Malaysia, and so on. And now, of course, even after the bailouts of the big banks, essentially the bailouts of the big banks merely transferred that indebtedness from the banks and the private financial system to the governments, right? That's why now what we're faced with are public debt crises, sovereign debt crises, and this is most clearly seen in Europe, in the case of Greece, but other economies in Europe are also on the brink. You have Italy, you have Spain, and so on. So the financialization, which of course in a sense is an attempt of the financial oligarchy to cope with the real contradictions in the system, wherein people do not have money because they're being exploited, and their wealth is based on exploiting people and keeping the majority poor. And now we're faced with a new global financial crisis in the offing, and this is the center of this is now more in the so-called emerging markets. After 2008, many of the emerging markets were heralded as the new growth centers, because Europe was in recession, the US was in recession, Japan has been in a recession for over a decade. In other words, the so-called engines of growth in the past, the centers of global capitalism, were in deep crisis. So they were looking to the emerging markets as the new growth centers. And true enough, much of the money that went to the financial system through quantitative easing were not used to create jobs in the US or in Europe and so on, but used for investing or re-lending in emerging markets. So you had financial bubbles now being created also in the emerging markets because of the loose credit that was applied through quantitative easing, for instance, in the US. So much of that money is reinvested or re-loaned in so-called emerging markets. And now these financial bubbles that were created are now starting to erupt as well. In China, you had stock market collapse a few weeks back. Although in the case of China, because the stock market isn't that big a proportion of the Chinese economy, then it's not as bad in terms of its impact as if it happens in the US, for instance. But nevertheless, it's an indication of things to come, of these financial bubbles that are erupting once again. And of course, because of the globalized economy, the globalized financial system, this has knock-on effects to the rest of the global economy. Next slide, please. Of course, side by side with the growing inequality, the growing impoverishment and exclusion and marginalization of the majority of the peoples of the world, you have the elites making sure that basically the status quo is not challenged and is not disrupted in a fundamental way. And so you have side by side with the economic and social inequities, you have growing fascisation or rise, in the case of the US, a so-called rise of the national security state, greater surveillance, greater police brutality, greater really tight the police system, the profit-oriented prison industrial complex in the US, making sure that a lot of the population is cowed into, or not challenging the existing laws and that protect the private property of the elites. And this, of course, next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. And of course, this is not just happening in the US. The trend of increasing militarism is rampant throughout the world. You have continued increasing US military presence, not just through direct troops, but through private contracted, essentially mercenary outfits. I think even in some places their presence is even greater than actual US troops. And it's not just US bases that are being built in different parts of the planet. It's also more military joint exercises or joint agreements or what they call access agreements with militaries of other countries. So, for instance, in the Philippines, of course, there are no official U.S. bases now because we kicked them out. The People's Movement kicked them out in the 90s. But the U.S. still has free access, basically, to all Philippine military facilities. And they have free access to dock their ships, the aircraft carriers, even with nuclear arms, which is against our constitution, by the way. They have free access to do that because of a military agreement between my government and the U.S. government. And these similar agreements are being inked with other countries as well. Of course, this is in the context of more conflicts erupting, also as a result of fundamental unjust and unequal systems, both national and the global. So you have in Ukraine essentially a proxy conflict between Russia and the U.S., and of course that's underlying that is control of natural gas and oil in that region. Similarly, the conflicts in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Turkey. On the one hand, supposedly it's about restoring democracy or establishing democracy against tyrannical governments, but also underneath, it's also about making sure that there's regime change, wherein the regimes that replace these autocrats are maybe new autocrats that are more favorable to U.S. imperialist interests in these areas. In North Africa and Central Africa, lots of conflicts as well there. This is more, of course, because of decades of the devastation of the productive base, the economic base in these countries, such as Somalia, wherein people basically don't have alternative livelihood opportunities and therefore resorting to piracy. And of course, resorting to armed Islamic fundamentalism as the ideological base for such resistance. Of course, we know Palestine that continues to be occupied, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Is somebody trying to say something? Okay.
No, my internet connection just crashed. So that's me. So I will be back in just a moment. I've already copied all the chat information. So when I go back in the room, if it initializes the chat, I've already saved it.
Okay. So
I'm
do I continue?
Letting everybody know.
Do I continue verbally without the slides?
You may continue verbally. I will catch the PowerPoint up.
Okay. Let me know if you're already in, PowerPoint. Okay. So clearly, that's the current situation where we're at globally. And I think that's a clear indictment of the failure of the so-called Millennium Development Goals and the Millennium Declaration 15 years ago, which promised to address all of these problems, no? But in effect, 15 years hence, we're in a worse situation. And so now looking back at the Millennium Development Goals and the so-called Millennium Declaration, what is clear is that these merely serve to sugarcoat or to raise hopes of people that globalization, which was at that time was still all the hype, that globalization can serve the people and the planet, and peace and prosperity for all. But now clearly that is clearly not the case. But now what we have is that they're now proposing to replace these failed MDGs. Of course, they do not admit its failure, but rather that it needs to be continued because it's unfinished. So now they're going to replace it with a new set of sustainable development goals. And Is the slide on already?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. So it's not so clear. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now this new Sustainable Development Goals that replace the MDGs, there are all 17 of them. So you have the first 7 in front of you. There are goals on, and of course still, on ending poverty, on ending hunger, on ensuring health, education, gender equality, water and sanitation for all, energy for all. Next slide, please. There's, of course, on employment, ensuring full, productive employment and decent work for all. There's about building infrastructure and ensuring industrialization and innovation. There's even a special goal there on reducing inequality within and among countries, something that was absent in the MDGs. There's about cities and urbanization, about ensuring sustainable consumption and production. That's the environmental dimension, which was also quite absent or very weak in the MDGs. There's something on climate change. Next slide, sorry. On oceans, on forests, on peace, and the last slide there, which talks about strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. That pertains to what governments as a multilateral system is willing to chalk up in terms of finance, in terms of technology, in terms of technical capacity building. So that's what they call means of implementation. So in other words, if you look at the new SDGs, there seems to be a promise for everyone's concerns. No? Everyone's problems is going to be addressed by these new SDGs. Next slide, please. And if you look at underneath each of these 17 goals, there are specific targets. All 169 of them. There are 169 targets altogether for all of these 17 goals. And of course, it's too long a list, obviously, to go through. But just to give you a flavor, if you look at under Goal 2, which is ending hunger, if you look at the slide in front of you, it talks about by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, particularly the poor, on food. By 2030, end all forms of malnutrition. By 2030, double agricultural productivity. In other words, they're committing to very concrete time-bound targets for these 17 goals. No? So in that sense, it seems, well, good. We should welcome these. Next slide, please. There's even here, for instance, on maintaining genetic diversity of seeds as one of the targets. Next slide. And of course, these last 3 points here is about what international system can do about it. It's about cooperation. It's about removing trade restrictions. And of course, this group would know what that means, right? And then the proper functioning of commodity markets and their derivatives. Look, take note that it's not about regulating or limiting derivatives trading. It's simply making sure that they function properly. Next slide. Now, of course, these are goals and targets. The declaration itself, the document that will be unveiled by the end of this week, does not specify how these goals and targets will be achieved. In the same way that the MDGs, they did not specify how the MDGs were supposed to be achieved. Of course, in the MDG experience, we know how they tried to achieve it, right? They implemented more liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. And that is precisely our fear or our estimation of what will happen once again with these SDGs. And one way to look at it is if you look at what the business sector is saying ought to be implemented, what policies and what measures ought to be implemented in order to achieve these goals. And the business sector is a good reference point because um, in the discussions on this declaration and the SDGs, the basic posture or position of governments, all governments, no, is that they don't have the money. And therefore, you need to rely on the private sector to mobilize resources that are in the hands of the private sector in order to achieve these goals. And so if that is their premise, then therefore you would expect that it's what businesses want to, what kind of measures and policies businesses want that are likely to be implemented in the name of achieving these goals. And if you look at the next slide, please. Um, just to take one example, goal 2 on ending hunger. This is what the business perspective is on that. This is a briefing paper that they circulated while they were lobbying for the new goals. They're saying here businesses can take part or are taking part through development of new crops and training farmers on new technologies. Of course, what we know what that means. It means more genetically modified organisms, more GM seeds that are patented by Monsanto, and making farmers even more dependent on that. And in some cases, the trend now is that use of traditional seeds by farmers are being criminalized, are being prohibited in favor of the use of these new seed technologies. They will go on to say that they will provide affordable and quality inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, farm equipment. In other words, there's a whole package of farm technologies that come along with the use of these GM seeds or these new hybrid seeds. And these farm technologies, what is happening is that, again, farmers become more dependent on these. And then lastly, if you look at the last part of that slide, they're saying that there's mutual advantage in integrating geographically and economically isolated smallholder farmers into the value chains of these global essentially agri-multinationals. And we know what it means in our experience. Next slide, please. All of these. So if the business agenda on ending hunger is to be implemented, it means greater control of these multinationals over the production and markets through the so-called market chains, or value chain, sorry. The greater dependence of these small farmers on corporate-controlled seeds and pesticides. And even in these markets, because in these so-called value chains, what happens is, for instance, in the Philippines, you have dole, tens of thousands of hectares of dole plantations here. But that's doubled by contract farming arrangements with other small farmers and peasants in surrounding areas. So these smallholder farmers are now under contract to supply pineapples to, say, Dole or Del Monte. And under that contract, it's Dole and Del Monte who sets what is to be planted, what kind of seeds to be planted, how much is to be paid, what kind of farm inputs are to be used, when they are delivered, at what rates. And in other words, everything is dictated by the buyer, by the agro corporate buyer of these in these supply contracts. So that's what these value chains look like in concrete terms. And the net effect, of course, is that it's true, yields are increasing, but because in producing these yields, farmers need to buy seeds, need to buy fertilizers, need to buy pesticides, need to buy farm equipment that are appropriate for these types of production, then their costs of production are actually increasing. So while gross incomes are, in some areas, are increasing, there is actually less incomes for farmers. And this is the story behind over 300,000 farmers who have already committed suicide in India because of bankruptcy over the last 2 decades. No? Because of the onslaught of corporatized, industrialized, and globalized agriculture. Next slide, please. And then there's the other side to this. I've already alluded to this because governments are saying there's no money, so they will resort to tapping private finance and private investors, and they're doing this in several ways. No, one trend is that they're relying more on what they call blended finance. That is to say, they're using official development assistance, foreign aid, combining it supposedly with private investment money, private finance, so that the private investors are incentivized to go into infrastructure projects or social development projects and so on. But many of these, according to studies, are actually going to profitable areas anyway. So in effect, ODA money, which is public money, in effect becomes used as subsidy for private investment that make money and make profits for these investors. The other and increasingly more common is the use of so-called public-private partnerships. And PPPs are a new, they're not so new, but they're increasingly more popular form of privatization because it's not outright privatization, it's supposedly essentially joint ventures between the public sector and private investors. Wherein the typical case is that the private investors provide the finance, the money, and governments provide guarantees. Essentially, what those guarantees mean that the private investors, say in an energy project, a power plant, or a dam, or a road project, or a airport, the private investors are guaranteed a revenue stream. And if that revenue stream is not met, usually they try to meet that revenue stream by charging their users, right? So if we have road projects, the investors in that road project charge tolls for using that. And if the money that they collect from charging tolls is not enough to meet the guaranteed revenue stream that they were promised by the government then picks up the difference, puts the bill for the difference. That's essentially what these guarantees mean. And that's true for road projects, for airports, for dam projects, for power supply agreements, and so on. So in effect, again, the profits are privatized, but the risks associated with these investments, which are usually large investments in infrastructure, they're guaranteed and they're borne by the public sector through these PPPs. And that's why you have now governments also increasingly more indebted because of what they call contingent liabilities from these PPPs. Not to mention that, in other words, the profits and the gains are privatized, the risks are socialized. And they're raising it to a new and higher level in recent years because now these PPPs are being bundled as new asset classes. In other words, it's not just one road project or two, but they're bundling several road projects, for instance, into, let's say, a new asset class. They would call it, say, ASEAN Connectivity Bond. And these bonds will be, of course, sold in the capital markets for financial investors, including financial speculators, to invest in these bonds. In the same way that, of course, they trade these financial assets around. So, in other words, it becomes another fodder for more financial trading and financial speculation in the financial market. So all of these is what they're doing or what they are likely to be doing in the name of implementing these or achieving these sustainable development goals. Next slide. Next slide. Um, so in other words, it's not enough. It's not yeah, it's not enough for us to actually examine the document that there will be unveiling next week, the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. If you go through them, they actually all look good. Um, what is important is to examine them in the context of broader trends of policies and measures that governments are actually doing on the ground, not what they're promising in these august halls of the UN. We mentioned privatization, deregulation. Next slide. Um, Next slide. Next slide. And this links up to what this group is most involved in, at least based on the conversation I heard this morning. If you look at the SDGs, and what's important to note is the SDGs are non-binding. No, like the MDGs, they're non-binding. They do not have consequences for governments if they do not achieve these goals. No, there is no penalties, no enforcement mechanism for these. These are just promises. On the other hand, these same governments that are making these promises in the form of SDGs are also, at least the most powerful among them, are also the ones involved in negotiating these new free trade agreements, no? As you're all familiar with. So it's not just TPP, it's TISA, it's TTIP, it's the economic partnership agreements with the EU, and so on. The so-called 21st century trade agreements. And of course, as we all know in this group, it's essentially about erecting new rules, global rules that strengthen global corporate power. And in fact, in many ways, veto power over government regulations, more privatization. There's, of course, strengthening IPR and so on, locking in trade liberalization. You know about all these, I'm sure, the lock-in provisions in some of these agreements. So, next slide. In effect, if we sum up this emerging post-2015 agenda, essentially the best that we can say about it is that it's an expanded and revamped MDGs. It takes up issues that were absent in the MDGs, and unfortunately, many people are welcoming it. Many CSOs and NGOs are welcoming it for that reason. And what we've been trying in the campaign for People's Goals is to really expose what are the likely implications of this by examining these promises in the context, or contrasting this in the context of what governments are actually doing on the ground, as well as what they're actually committing to in other fora. And in particular, these FTAs, which are binding, we know are binding, which we know have consequences. These agreements will be ratified by governments. These will be ratified and translated to national legislation and laws and have national enforcement. So this is the real binding agenda. That's the real emerging development agenda. What they're doing outside of what they're promising in the UN. So in effect, the SDGs, because they will be hyped up and they will be promoted very aggressively through the public relations machinery of the UN and the UN system and the donor agencies, then they will serve, like the MDGs, to serve as sugarcoating, as false promises, as false hopes for the people, and in effect serving to legitimize and revive capitalist growth model, capitalist neoliberalism, and a legitimization for more imperialist globalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We were chatting in the chat room about how back in the days, what you were presenting was always part of what we saw in science fiction movies, or we would also see it in comedies. So it is really incredible and very frightening that this is now true and becoming more true every day. Paul, would you be willing to hang around for a few minutes for questions?
Yes, certainly.
All right, thank you very much. Now, because we're going to run a little bit over, I'm going to ask anyone that has a question to press *6. That will put you on the stack. So I know you have a question, and I'm also going to ask you to confine yourself to a question and not a soliloquy or a long statement. All right, my very first question is from our dear activist and friend, and I'm waiting for his line to unmute. There it is, Paul Flansburgh. Paul, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Mr. Quintos. A lot of what you said is very disturbing, yet a lot of us become aware of it because of these calls. However, have you ever been personally victimized by any aspect of what you've been saying?
So, hello?
Is there a personal story that you have?
Can somebody try to restate the question, because it's very choppy? I couldn't understand.
Oh, right. You're very choppy, Paul. Paul, just say the question part. Yes, what he said is incredibly disturbing. We didn't hear the literal question itself. Just react that, Paul.
Do you have a personal story about how you've been victimized?
A personal, about me, myself?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, I work for an NGO which works with people's organizations in the Philippines as well as in other countries, no? And like I said in the beginning, I was actually involved in organizing some of the plantation workers in Mindanao, southern Mindanao, in the early 2000s. And it was there that I at least witnessed firsthand the impacts of how these agro-multinational corporations like Dole essentially control the entire economy, the local economy in that area. And it was amazing. It wasn't just their control of the livelihoods of the people, because the entire economy was dependent on Dole. And of course the government wasn't spending on public services, so even schools were involved. Were partly financed or dependent on Dole. Some of the hospitals were partly dependent and financed by Dole, and so on. So the entire social economy and the politics of the local areas were dependent and controlled by Dole. So when the workers started organizing for better wages, better working conditions, more job security, and so on, the company really mobilized the entire political infrastructure in the area to go against the union drive, the collective bargaining demands of the workers there. They even asked, of course, indirectly through the local politicians. They had all the radio stations were speaking out against the union and speaking out against the collective negotiations. Teachers were telling their students to convince their parents not to join the collective actions or mass actions of the workers in the area, that kind of local, that kind of control over the lives of the people there. And that's happening. In other words, these value chains aren't just, economic relations. These value chains are ways by which these big, giant corporate TNCs are able to really dig deep and plant their roots even in the hinterlands, even in the most quote unquote backward or underdeveloped areas of poor countries like in the Philippines.
Thank you, Paul. Our next question, you're showing up on my board as April McKay. April.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
We hear you fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I could ask a million questions. Thank you for this opportunity. I am wondering, do you think the solution is ecological economics? And if so, how would the power shift work? That's probably complicated, but yeah, what do you think of ecological economics being the answer?
I'm not sure what you mean by ecological economics. Can you maybe summarize it in the gist of it?
It's in the University of Vermont. They have the GUND or something like that, GUN University. They're it's saying that basically it's a reframing the value system from the economy is usually in a graph is the big square, and then the environment and workers are within that square, but they're saying to instead make the bigger square be the ecological system, and then the economy is within that, and so I don't know.
Yeah, well, if it's in terms of a framing, a way of framing the economy as embedded in ecology, I think that's correct, in the sense that, of course, our economy is totally dependent ultimately on a natural resource base, whether it's production of food, whether it's about people's health and livelihoods. It's very much dependent on the natural environment, and of course, so in that sense, I agree with that. But if by ecological economics, it means the mainstream interpretation of it, which is that you simply cost properly, what economists call internalizing the externalities. In other words, the uncounted, unestimated cost of pollution, of environmental degradation, even biodiversity loss. You try to cost that and incorporate those costs in the financial accounting of corporations, of the private sector. Then that's a way of incentivizing them to economize on the use of resources, or to minimize pollution because it's going to cost them if they pollute, and so on. So in other words, use the market mechanism to change people's behavior in order to be more environmentally conscious and environmentally friendly. Now, with that, I have a problem, because one example that they're doing that, for instance, is in the climate change discussions, right? In the climate change discourse, they've incorporated offsets. That is to say, corporations in rich countries can continue polluting as long as they buy offsets, like forests in third world countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, buy certain hectares of forest, which is equivalent to an X amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are being absorbed by these forests, and therefore the equivalent of those greenhouse gas emissions that are being absorbed by the forest that are paid for by, let's say, by I don't know, British Airways, then British Airways can just continue with its pollutive greenhouse gas emitting operations, because it's buying offsets for it. I hope you get what I mean.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that in many of these forests, indigenous peoples are being displaced, because the indigenous peoples that used to be dependent on these forests, not by virtue of having patents, or having land titles, because that's the problem. Many of indigenous people do not have land titles. They're based on traditional ancestral domains. They're the ones who are being displaced from these natural systems where they're dependent on. And that's why there's this big debate among indigenous peoples on the question of how to regard these, they call it red mechanisms in the climate change negotiations. No? Anyway, so that's an example. In other words, or another example would be, let's say, renewable energy. They're, of course, incentivizing renewable energy over fossil fuel energy. Many of these are dams. So they say dams are, again, the solution. But in a similar fashion, many of these mega dam projects are displacing and inundating indigenous territories, rural peoples, and rural communities, all in the name of, even in the name of renewable energy. So for me, it's not so much the market mechanism that is important and market-based incentives. It's about who controls what. And that's what we need to democratize. We need to, if we're really going to change the system, including protecting the planet, we need to democratize control and ownership over productive resources and decision-making on how productive resources are utilized for meeting people's needs, including the needs of future generations. And you cannot ask politicians to do that. You cannot ask markets to do that. It has to be through the collective discussion, deliberation, debate, and decision-making of communities that are affected by these. Sorry, I took too long. Sorry.
That was a very good answer, Paul. Thank you very much. We've got two more questions. Caller on area code 718, your line is open. Caller on area code 718, going once. All right, let's try my next caller at area code 503. Your line's open.
Thank you. This is Dean Edwards with Democracy Watch News. I am very curious, given the political elite family structure which is often is pretty much regionally based in the Philippines, and some of the other concerns you've raised, what would you say are the largest challenges, or perhaps you might want to identify a single challenge to democracy in the Philippines today?
I think it's similar to the challenge in democracy everywhere, which is the continued elite control and monopoly over the basis of livelihoods of the majority of the population. In our case, outside the urban areas, it's really land. So a few families still control the land upon which the people are dependent on in terms of their livelihoods, and through that, they're basically controlled socially, politically as well. So you have, for instance, our Congress, is majority of whom are actually come from landed families, landed gentry. They're also the ones who are running the big local businesses. So it's typical that we have, I don't know how many generations now, how many versions of land reform, which is about redistributing the land, but none of them have actually redistributed the land, because they're all full of loopholes that are built in by the elites who stand to lose from a real implementation of these redistributive measures. And you can draw parallels with that in terms of the industries, in terms of the businesses in the Philippines. I think it's similar throughout the world. No, I think Oxfam made a recent study of how economic power. Of course, this is not new. Economic power is also translated in terms of the elite capture of political systems, of elections, of electoral systems. And so even your representative democracy is not so representative in reality. So I think that's the biggest challenge in terms of democracy.
Thank you, Paul. This is our last question. Let's try this again. Caller on area code, it's coming up, 718.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Quintos, for this incredible rundown of all the bad things.
Sorry.
It was extremely complete, or it seemed to be complete. And I think all of us on the call, being activists, our first response is, so what can we do? And I wondered if there was maybe it's just what we've been doing, all the stuff that we've been doing, just putting one foot in front of the other and keep on doing it. Is there any particular strategy that you have in mind that could really help in terms of, getting the people activated and working together and bringing some force to bear against the other, the 1%?
I don't have a blueprint. I think I have as many ideas as you guys, or maybe less. In terms of, I guess, from what I was hearing from your conversation earlier, I think you're all doing very good work in terms of challenging the most, I guess, the most inimical of these new offensives, particularly the free trade agreements. I guess one thing coming from the Philippines, in other words, coming from outside the U.S., what I would like to see more of is more international solidarity, in particular with the people's movements from the Global South. I think that's an extremely important link that we need to strengthen and further develop in many, and I guess, to be candid with you, in some even in some activist circles, in some movements, sometimes there's an underemphasis or under representation of perspectives from the Global South. When we're talking in the centers of many of these battles, right? When we're talking about what's happening in the UN or what's happening in Europe and so on, the impacts and implications and what needs to be done in developing countries, in the underdeveloped countries, in terms of the movements there, they're not being heard enough, I think. And I think that's one thing that we need to strengthen in order to really challenge this system. Because really, I think, and to put it in an abstract way, the global system is very much able to continue and sustain itself by its overexploitation and oppression of people in the Global South. Of course, not just us that are being exploited and oppressed, but Apple wouldn't be able to continue its operation selling the iPad. There's this recent study, the iPad, just to give you an example, the labor cost in iPads is about $33 out of what's the retail cost now, over I don't know, 500. How much is an iPad? 500 or something. Anyway, it's just $33. one study says that that same labor, if it were done in the U.S., would cost over $400 per iPad. So in other words, the difference between using cheap labor in China versus using cheap labor in the U.S. is over $300. That amount goes to enriching Apple per iPad. Imagine how many iPads, how many phones, how many cars, how many garments and shoes are being produced in the third world exploiting cheap labor. In other words, it's what's sustaining global capitalism. And therefore, we need to support and strengthen struggle in the Global South in order to challenge the system.
Paul, I want to thank you so very much for joining us tonight. It has been incredibly depressing, but, the only thing you can say is the truth will set you free. And there are many things that I know you included in your presentation that I probably knew and would have figured out, but when you see it kind of very starkly there on its slide, it is pretty darn depressing. But again, I think it really encourages all of us to keep doing what we're doing, and again, keep putting that one foot in front of the other to continue letting other people know what is going on, that this is not a trade deal, that this is not good for anybody that any of us knows, and it is very important that we do everything we can to stop it. So, because there was so much information, the PowerPoint has already been uploaded to www.peopledemandingaction.org. In the download section, if you go to that website, literally right on the home page under download, which is about halfway down the home page on the right, you'll see a link to the PowerPoint. If you wait 5 minutes, I will also have the link to the recording of this call. Again, I want to thank our very special guest, Paul Quintos. Hopefully, when we have you back, you will have at least one piece of encouraging news for us. It has been a delight, sir. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to end the recording.